Hello again, this is Andrew, still broadcasting from the US, while I struggle to fight my way through the nightmare of bureaucracy that is the People's Republic of China these days. Hopefully, if I'm a good boy, and I'm very lucky, they will let me enter as early as November. But in the meantime, I'm gonna instead make use of some other people's content. Very trendy thing at the moment. Actually, I've kind of fallen into this thing with street interviews. There's a lot of people who do street interviews, a lot of them in particular in East Asia, and we're going to look at some of those, and I'm going to give you kind of my insight on what they're saying, a little bit of background on these. This first one comes from one of the larger groups on YouTube. It's a channel called Asian Boss. They do these kind of videos in a lot of different countries. But they do tend to be kind of concentrated in China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines as well. And we're going to look at, I'm choosing to start with a topic that I know something about, this was from a little over a year ago, and this was about China's video game Crackdown, which I will explain in a minute what that was if you didn't remember it. But in the meantime, let's just take a look.
Hey bosses, it's Marie from Asian Boss. Many would agree that online gaming addiction for children and minors is increasingly becoming a serious problem everywhere. But can you imagine your government putting restrictions on the hours that children are allowed to spend playing online games? This is one of the recent measures rolled out by the Chinese government as part of its effort to combat online gaming addiction in the country. Now, if you didn't know, China is the largest video game market in the world, and its ongoing freeze on video game licenses is said to have shut down over 14,000 gaming-related companies. So what do ordinary Chinese citizens think of these heavy regulations on gaming? Do parents bear any responsibilities? We hit the streets of Shanghai to find out.
Okay, let's stop this for a second here. Already, she probably said something that many of you don't agree with, that everybody considers video game addiction as a big problem. A few years ago, this was a big topic of discussion for a lot of people who had no idea what they were talking about. But video game addiction effectively does not exist in this part of the world. People will show you, it's in, I think it's in the DSM-5, some kind of thing like that, as more or less a use disorder. It's not applied anywhere. Like, there a lot of paranoia about people being locked up, which was never going to happen. Not in the West. But the funny part is that kind of thing does happen in East Asia, where they take this very, very seriously. One of the, I review indie games on the side, and one of the ones I looked at this year was a Chinese, actually interactive movie, an FMV game called Breakout 13, which was based on a popular piece of web fiction in that part of the world that was a fictionalized version of some actual, like, tough love and behavioral modification clinics that were for internet addiction. And I actually have a whole article on that, 2 articles actually, because the first one I got a lot of things wrong. But just for the short term, just keep in mind, people freaked out about this here, but it basically isn't in effect in this part of the world. But in East Asia, especially China and Korea, it's a really big deal. Now, in terms of what the government did, they're going to describe it in a little bit, but there's actually talking about 2 things. There's a specific policy restricting when and how much minors can play video games online, which, by the way, is important to note. If single-player games, they wouldn't know, but multiplayer games are kind of, in mainland Asia, are kind of the heart of this. The other thing is a freeze on video game licenses, which I'll talk about in just a minute, but I want to get this going again.
今天我们想了解，因为国家最近有对游戏的严格的监管，就是会限制未成年人的游戏时间。首先，你有听说过这个政策吗？
听说过。
对，我听说过。
那在抖音上偶尔会看到，但是实际性的文件我还没有看到过。
有，但是国家政策应该是一步一步来的。比如说，第一个阶段它会限制时间，第二个阶段它会比如说断网什么这一类的，应该是从这个时候开始的吧。
其实就是政策说，未成年18岁以下呢，周五只能在周五、周六、周日和节假日晚上8点到9点之间玩游戏，包括游戏公司的游戏许可证被解冻。那你听这个政策时，你第一个反应是什么？
应该的。
我觉得可以啊，因为像我们中国国内的话，有很多学生平时就是放假，有休息时间他就玩，最好是规定一个时间，很少玩，这样最好。
觉得
Okay, pause that for a second. I want to throw in one thing because, again, this was over a year ago. Right now, we know that this actually it worked. Like, it actually did appear to reduce the amount of time that minors played video games in China. Now, I've been a little skeptical as to how much of that was due to this policy and how much of it was due to the parents, but it's there. It's in the numbers, it's in the facts, and yeah, so this appears to have been effective at their intended goal. Continuing.
对于孩子来说还是挺好的，因为对于孩子的学习成长的话，有着一定的自控嘛。然后对于成人的话，是不是就太局限了？因为我也玩游戏，如果到了8、9点，礼拜六、礼拜天，因为你第二天又不上班，对吧？那干嘛呢？肯定就是玩游戏啊、看电视啊，对吧？如果到这个阶段的话，那还是蛮难受的。
我觉得这个政策很好啊。
为什么呢？
首先，学生是祖国未来的花朵，如果长期沉溺于网络游戏的话，或者对他们有伤害的，不管是视力啊，还是等等各方面的东西，而且劳逸结合嘛，也说了，周五、周六、周日可以让他们适当的去玩一玩，也是可以的呀。
So that was there's a specific point in there that I want to bring up, which is the thing about eyesight. Now, the status of video games in mainland Asia is complicated. I've written on what it was like in both China and Korea, but in China in particular, it goes back a long ways. And the initial complaint was actually that it would damage children's eyesight. That was during the the roots of this kind of anti-video game sentiment in the 80s. That was the concern in China. The other stuff about it being a distraction from homework, that actually came later. And the stuff about addiction and all of that, that was more in the 90s and the 2000s. So continuing.
怎么说？对学生来说，可能就是说，因为我也是学生嘛，就是我也是就是过来的，对于学生来说，就是他们很想玩游戏，但对于家长来说，就是还是学习比较重要。怎么说？这个东西也有利也有弊。
你认为为什么国家会出这些限制，让游戏变得如此严格呢？
我认为这是一个很好的办法，因为小孩子整天在玩游戏，荒废了很多事，不管是小孩还是中年人，都是这回事。
下一代就是希望他们更着重于学习吧，健康的一个成长一个环境吧，应该是更加。现在国家可能就是更注重培养下一代吧。
因为这个游戏对这个下一代啊，就是年轻的小孩甚至未成年的小孩吧，危害太大了。因为他一玩就上瘾，一上瘾他就把自己这个学业全部扔掉了，天天就抱着手机玩，以后将来就没出路了。
Spiritual poison. Yeah, I froze it in just the right part. Spiritual poison, spiritual opium. These are terms. Probably, if you've heard this story, the Western press really focused on a handful of these opinion pieces. It's more complicated than that, but there's no question that there is, really among the Chinese elites, an understanding that really, I think a lot of them would just as soon ban video games, but at this point, like they said, China is the largest overall video game market in the world, and it's just not gonna happen. Now, this was part of a series of restrictions. It wasn't just on video games. There were a bunch of them. One thing that really affected a lot of my fellow teachers was there was an extreme crackdown on private learning centers, which resulted in most of them essentially going out of business. There were still a lot of smaller ones that the government just didn't know about, that they just kind of continued to allow them to operate. People run those things out of their apartments. There were also these really strange, I don't know if there were any formal restrictions or any policy, but there was a lot of concern about what we would call fandoms. Fandoms for especially singers and actors, that people were focusing too much on them, and also that these performers themselves were bad, that there was moral problems with the people that especially teenagers were choosing to follow online, with the big concern believe it or not, being that the male singers were too femmy, more or less. Continuing.
媒体它会把网络游戏称为精神鸦片或者电子毒品。以你所看，中国的这个网瘾问题有多严重呢？
不是多严重，是非常严重。因为不是一般化的人都一般化的什么少年儿童，只要他拿到手机，第一时间就是说点开游戏，进入角色玩，一玩了就耽误学业了，而且一玩这个不可收拾，不可就是抑制的等于他一直玩下去，他什么考虑什么作业啊？只要朝床上朝家里一坐，对吧？我那孙子都是的，朝家里一坐，手机一拿开来就是游戏。
那我有一个同事，刚才我也在和我同事说，他已经40几岁了，好了，工作没了，就整天玩游戏啊，老板开除了。你想本职工作都做不好，我今天要叫他去看心理医生，我陪他去。
Okay, stop there. That was something I wasn't expecting to see. Psychiatry in China. Here's the thing: if you have gone to a shrink, and especially if you're on meds, you don't talk about it. Like, it's just not done in that part of the world. Things are changing like they are everywhere else, but in a lot of places there is still a belief, really in that entire part of the world, that mental health problems are just kind of a sign of weakness. So if you are suggesting that someone go to a psychiatrist, then especially a family member or a close friend, then you must think that person has a serious problem. Because otherwise the social stigma attached to that kind of thing would be damaging. So you must think that whatever damage would be caused by that stigma is outweighed by the problem of the addiction. Continuing.
他们玩得很厉害，我知道，比如说一个叫《原神》的游戏吧，其实《原神》这个游戏我自己应该是我喜欢会玩的类型，因为我自己会玩塞尔达，但我塞尔达已经玩完了以后，我就没有再继续玩任何其他游戏了。然后他们就会不停告诉我《原神》跟塞尔达有多么相似，怎样。但是就像我刚才讲的，他们告诉我《原神》，就我那个朋友他，比如说3个月到6个月，他就花了大概快6000到1万左右，我听这个费用就直接吓退了。
我觉得有点夸张了。就其实还好，那他们以前那个打游戏的职业战队，在以前不也是被别人说成这样吗？但人家现在不打的也很好。
We're talking about esports. All right. So that's a big deal in mainland Asia, especially Korea. I visited a couple of esports arenas while I was living there. It's a big deal in China too. I actually knew some of my students were they were like in training to do competitive video games, or they were aspiring to it. And yeah, I knew people who got into that so much it did start to impact their lives. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. The comment about people's Genshin Impact, which, if you don't know, is probably the biggest deal Chinese game outside of China. Most of their gaming market is very internal, but Genshin Impact has been very popular in the West. And the notion of people spending, upwards of $1,000 or more is plausible. I don't want to spend half an hour talking about microtransactions and how they've ruined the industry, but if you know about this, you probably agree with me, so we can just continue from here.
我觉得就是看法问题，如果你真的很出色的话，那没必要去限制，你有可能就扼杀了某一方面的天才了。
你个人认为为什么当下社会有这个网瘾的这个问题？
可能是互联网络太发达了，还有智能手机各方面的更新的太快了，对，然后又便宜，然后家长联系小朋友可能要给他配个智能机，智能机之后，他们会下这些东西去玩了。
Okay, couple quick notes on that. One, the video game market in mainland China is about 90% PC and mobile. Consoles have very little presence. In Korea, it's only slightly larger. It's only maybe 5% consoles. But the other thing about the phones is parents are actually, a lot of them do not get their children very advanced phones. A lot of kids in that country, and I want to point this out because when Americans talk about the world, we tend to assume that the world is comprised of 7 billion Americans who just don't know they're Americans yet. But we are all different. Our cultures do not look the same. We're not just the same people with like different colorful clothing. Most of my younger students did not have smartphones. Most of them won't have one until they get to college. Before that, the young kids have a thing they wear. It's basically like a watch that they can use to send like a text message to their parents when they're done with class. And then the older ones, kind of middle, what we would call middle and high school, will have like an older phone, an older model phone that generally can't run apps. It is just there to make phone calls, make and receive phone calls, and send and receive text messages. And yeah, a lot of them complain about this, but for the most part, this is one way that parents restrict how their children play video games. And there is a lot of parental restriction. The Western, especially the American writers, all assume that Chinese kids and American kids are exactly the same, and they're not. And we'll probably be getting into that in a minute. Continue.
而且一刷，它会根据你的兴趣爱好，比如说推荐你这类的东西。比如我看篮球，他就推荐篮球；他看那个赛车就推荐赛车。主要就是也会是赢。
他们同学之间相互影响，还有游戏，基本上都是一些卡通人物，会对小孩子构成特别大的诱惑力，而且他们还可以自主操控这些卡通人物。所以说就会让他们特别的上瘾。
因为很多人就是因为这次的一个政策是个国家的一个政策，对吧？国家政策是说，限制未成年人上网玩游戏的一个政策。你作为家长，你觉得这是否应该是家长来负责呢，而不是应该是国家来管？
So before we even get into that, this is what I was saying. I used to hear commentators who were just completely clueless saying, "Oh, the kids are just going to sneak out of the house." That's not no. First of all, if you haven't been in like a Chinese family's apartment, if you have, you'll immediately see why this is essentially impossible. But again, they're not American kids. This country has a heritage of people really respecting what their parents say a lot more than we do. But also just structurally, the way society's built, there's a lot less personal privacy. There's a lot less distance between you and your family when you grow up in this country. So your parents have a lot more control over what you do. One thing that's been said a lot about not just China, but East Asia in general, when it comes to video games, and especially video game consoles. And here we're kind of moving into Japan a little more, because like I said, it's not a big deal in China or Korea. It is in Japan, obviously, because most of the companies are there. Is most the kids in these countries, at least traditionally, did not have televisions in their rooms. So if you were playing video games, it was in the family room with everyone else around you. So this was just a completely different sort of setup. And I think a lot of the commentators who talked about these policies just did not understand that. They kept figuring that these were just American kids with funny names. Continuing.
其实我觉得这个大环境很多东西，你看网络这么发达，都是全部现在都是网络世界。你说全部靠家长来做的话，你看网上抖音啊，还有什么所谓的什么视频啊，全部都有。你其实是盯不好的，因为现在对于青少年来讲，因为像年纪比较小的，像我女儿，她没有一个自控能力。然后我们也不可能24小时看着他，对吧？然后如果有了这样的一个条例以后，如果自动限制的话，我觉得对青少年是好的。
最主要应该是家长的角色，国家来干预的话是非常好的，是非常好的一个大环境的大环境的一个途径。最重要的还是要家长自己来控制。但是有些家长他为了能小孩子不调皮什么，就把手机甩给他，就让他自己玩了。其实这样也是不对的。
父母他有自己的工作的时间，还有一些其他的事情要处理，不可能完全会对小孩怎么样，我这样盯着你，那小孩也不会觉得我。
Okay, I'm stopping this for a dumb joke, but I have to. I have actually heard Chinese people say that they don't think that American parents care about their kids, which is a weird thing to say, but here's what's weird to them. The term helicopter parent. In China, that's just parenting. This idea of, you're doing too much for your kids, you're spending too much time for your kids. It blows their mind when I have to tell them, we have a term for this, and it's derogatory. Continuing.
爸爸妈妈为什么这么管我？很不民主，很不自由。小孩都会有那个叛逆期啊等等这些东西的，有个这样的强硬措施也是蛮好的。
这个我觉得，家长如果有时间的话可以管，但没时间，我觉得他也没有办法，因为 因为是小孩子嘛都那样，就也很喜欢玩，我当然也是一样，很正常。
除了那个限制游戏时间，你有看到过国家它采取其他的这种提高效率的这个政策吗，或者措施吗？
有啊，就比如说王者荣耀里面，假如说你玩4-5个小时以后，它就会再提示你一下，就是说你玩多长时间，然后让你稍微休息一下之类的。我觉得提示挺好的，就有可能有的时候我自己玩的时候，我都忘了玩多长时间。
比如说实名制啊，有些游戏现在必须要实名制身份证，验证过后才能玩。我觉得这样的方法也挺好的。有很多游戏就因为实名制，小孩都玩不了。
我自己偶尔我也刷抖音，但是有可能看见了提示了，早点休息。
好像有看到过，但是还是能接着刷。像我这种人肯定是不影响，我当没看见。
它只是个提示，它提示了，那你知道的人就会去停下，不知道的人就划走下一条。我能不知道我该休息了吗？就是还是会去刷嘛，就看个人了。
那你觉得除了限制时间化，还有什么其他的措施可以考虑？就是假如说家长可以做什么等等？
家长那也要家长给自己小孩做规矩做好嘛。如果你家教是好的话，我觉得小孩子他自己就不会沉迷，因为知道我家长会让我玩这个。
And again, so much of this, a lot of the impact is if you just don't believe that video game addiction exists, then obviously this is all going to sound crazy. But in this part of the world, they take this very seriously. I've said that before. I'm going to emphasize it for you here. They take it very seriously. And yeah, I could do an entire another video telling you how seriously they took it. But we'll just let that go for now.
是禁止我玩这个，你只要给他一个度，他就会自己掌握好这个时间。我是觉得是。就可以把这个游戏当做一个放松，而不是我是依赖这个游戏的。
看设备上来说，可能不要买 iPhone 13，给小朋友买 iPhone 什么 SE 或者6、7，把你们淘汰的比较过时的设备给他们。
家长可以带小孩参与一些游戏之外的一些活动。一些亲子活动，做下其他的体育项目吧。不一定，现在我觉得小孩子的体质是最重要的。
你认为就是这个现在国家出了这个政策来限制游戏时间，从长远看来，你觉得是有效的吗？
我觉得不一定有效。以前不也限制吗？然后后面反正政策一直都在变。有可能他觉得现在这个会过激了，然后之后就会换一个柔和一点的，柔和的就又没有效果了，所以这个还是得看个人。
你能看到有任何的副作用吗？就是有什么负面的一种效果呢？
负面的效果可能就是某些他们这个行业的经济上就是那个可能会受到一定的损失吧。应该是整个行业会不会牵扯到很大？比如说是有一些小的游戏开发公司或者干嘛，他们实体上的经济可能会员工这些经济上可能会受到影响。其实我们现在
The big one there is the freeze on video game licenses. I kind of skipped over this earlier, but in China, the Chinese government really does exert a lot of control over the entertainment media. And part of it is you kind of can't get anything out, especially anything foreign, but even internal, without a license. So when they do a freeze on the video game licenses, the Chinese video game industry pretty much grinds to a halt. Now, again, I review indie games. I interview the people who create them. It's an international thing. They're all over the place. There are a lot of them in China. They're mostly mobile developers. And when they have these freezes, kind of all those companies just drop dead. And this has happened several times. It's really the result of that is it's just kind of made the rich get richer because we do still have like Tencent's getting into video games right now. A lot of the bigger Chinese companies they're running these gigantic video games. They're the ones that get to keep operating. They're all live services. They're all operating continuously. They get to keep operating and they get bigger. And it's just another example of the Chinese government picking winners and losers, which is very common. Continuing.
我觉得还是人和人之间天天就在刷，比如说我们两个朋友见面都在玩手机，
You have no
都在
idea
看
if you
手
haven't
机，
been to China
其
how
实
true
缺
that
乏了
is.
很多的沟通和交流。你像以前大家都还会看看报纸啊，或者聊聊天，饭前鱼后的聊聊天，对吧？现在朋友跟朋友见面基本都不怎么聊了，
Nope.
就是都在看手机，大家都在这么玩。
No, I know you're probably saying, "Oh, it's like that here too." Oh no, no, it's not. You don't even know. You don't even know. You will see that they will go out. You know, I live on college campuses when I work there, and I'll see the kids go out. They'll go out in groups of 4. They'll go to a restaurant, and they'll just look at their phones and ignore each other. And it's not, when people said that when people talk about, oh, people use their phones too much in like the States or in Europe, it means people check them too much. But in China, the phone never goes away. I've seen people almost get in accidents so many times because they can't put the phone down. And yeah, it's so much more intense. If you haven't been to China, then you don't even know. You almost don't have a right to complain about people using their phones too much if you haven't seen how Chinese kids use them.
是相反，这种人会变得很冷漠的。如果说是把这种时间长了，那么人和人是他有一种倾诉的一个，像比如说我也像你想说说话聊聊天，这么一来的话，可能人会更温暖一些吧。
Okay, so that was about what I expected to see. I think the response in China to this was mostly positive at the time. It still probably is. Even among my students, most of them, this is kind of the same thing you hear from them is, well, it's just there to help the kids who have a problem so that they can stay in school and pay attention. So this is not remotely controversial in that part of the world. Again, you had a lot of critics who said, oh, this is going to come to the United States next, but we have a completely different culture. Especially at this point, I'd say the odds of seeing anything like this in the United States are about as close to 0 as you can get without it being 0. So, but in China, there is kind of a cultural history of this in terms of this control from parents and from the government.